The first sound is not gunfire or engines, but tires fighting for their life in mud. It is late autumn of 1942, somewhere between Dawson Creek and the Yukon border, and the world here is nothing but gray sky, black spruce, and a road that is still more promise than reality. Rain falls as a thin needling curtain, mixing with half-frozen slush on the surface of the newly cut track. Headlights crawl through it, dim yellow cones swallowed by fog, while a lead truck bucks and fishtails, its chains squealing, its engine grumbling under the weight of ammunition crates and aviation fuel. Inside the cab, a young driver from Texas keeps both hands locked around the wheel, knuckles white under grease and mud, feeling the rear wheels slide toward the shoulder where the muskeg waits like a trapdoor. He curses the road, curses the forest, curses the order that sent him north, but somewhere beneath the anger there is another emotion, one he would never admit out loud: fear of what happens if this road fails. Up ahead, standing on the shoulder in a slick of icy water, a captain from the Corps of Engineers listens to the chain of trucks grinding past. The smell around him is a strange mix: wet pine, diesel fumes, and the sour tang of exhaust that hangs low in the cold air. To the west, beyond the wall of trees, he can almost feel rather than see the arc of the Aleutian Islands, where Japanese planes have already bombed Dutch harbor, and infantry in foreign uniforms have stepped onto American soil. Somewhere over his head, transport planes he cannot see are following beacons toward airfields, strung like beads through Canada and Alaska. This road, this ridiculous scar of mud and broken stumps, is now the spine that feeds them. And yet, he remembers, not so many months ago, men in polished offices thousands of miles away called this very highway insane. At the very beginning of 1942, before the mud and the mosquitoes and the frozen fingers, the idea of a highway to Alaska sat in dusty folders and in the dreams of a few stubborn men. For years, promoters in Seattle and Edmonton had drawn lines on maps, imagining a bold ribbon of asphalt tying the north to the continent. Washington, however, had smiled politely and filed the idea away. Why carve a road through wilderness when ships and trains already existed? Why waste money on a region that generals dismissed with a shrug? "No one will attack Alaska," one staff officer said over coffee in late 1941, as if saying it made it so. In the hierarchy of priorities, the frozen north was a footnote, a place for fur trappers and bush pilots, not a front line in a world war. Then December 7th burned that arrogance away, and the explosions in Hawaii shook far more than battleships. In the weeks that followed, as maps of the Pacific covered conference tables in Washington, another realization slipped into the room like an unwelcome guest. The Japanese Empire did not always strike where Americans expected. Their carriers had crossed entire oceans in secret. Their submarines stalked shipping lanes thousands of miles from home, and that lonely chain of islands stretching from the Alaskan mainland toward Asia suddenly looked less like a forgotten corner of the map and more like a bridge, one that could be used in either direction. Still, even as the shock of Pearl Harbor reverberated, the old reflexes held. Navy voices argued that the ocean, not the tundra, would decide the war. Air officers insisted that planes could leap the distances without needing a new road gouged through Canada's north. Quartermasters quietly calculated the cost of every mile of proposed highway and winced. In late winter meetings, when the word Alaska Highway surfaced, some planners rolled their eyes. "A highway to nowhere," one congressman muttered. "We need tanks and ships, not a vanity road for northern dreamers." The North, in their minds, was still safely distant, shielded by cold and distance and their own assumptions. And then, in June 1942, Japanese bombs fell on Dutch harbor, and the Aleutian sky turned black with smoke. Sailors watched in disbelief as enemy aircraft, bearing the red circle they had seen in photos from Pearl Harbor, roared over the fog-shrouded harbor of Unalaska Island. Not long after, small enemy forces set foot on Attu and Kiska, tiny islands by any global measure, but abruptly enormous in symbolic weight. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops occupied American soil. Suddenly the phrase, "No one will attack Alaska," sounded less like analysis, and more like a bad joke told in the wrong room. Panic is too simple a word for what followed in certain offices, but it comes close. The northern flank of the continent, which had barely merited a paragraph in planning documents, now glared like a red warning light. If the Aleutians could be taken, what about the ports farther east? What if enemy submarines used the cold, stormy waters off Alaska as staging grounds to approach the rich industrial coast of British Columbia and the American Northwest? There were fears, some realistic, some exaggerated, of Japanese forces using the islands as springboards, of air raids farther inland, of a creeping threat along a jagged coastline that few in Washington could even picture in their minds. The question that emerged, heavy and urgent, was deceptively simple. How do you defend a frontier that is barely connected to the nation on paper, much less in steel and concrete? Ships could bring men and supplies north, yes, but the same seas that carried them could turn feral in an instant. The North Pacific was a theater of storms as much as of ships, with waves that could snap a hull and winds that could ground aircraft for days. Air routes arcing through Canada were crucial but fragile, dependent on scattered airfields and the bravery of pilots flying over endless forests and mountains. If anything went wrong, if a base needed emergency fuel, if equipment had to be rushed to reinforce a shattered garrison, there was no solid, continuous path on land to do it. That was when the crazy road was pulled back onto the table, not as a dream, but as a necessity. The man who pushed it hardest was not a politician, but General Brian Somervell, chief of the Army's Services of Supply, a figure whose job was to care about the unglamorous things that kept armies alive. Somervell was not blind to the difficulties. He had heard the jokes about carving a highway through permafrost and muskeg. He knew what it would mean to push thousands of men and machines into a region where winter came early and lingered. But he also understood something that the scoffers in Washington did not yet see clearly. Logistics, not bravado, was the real weapon that would decide whether Alaska held or fell. When Somervell's staff laid out the numbers, distances, tonnage, timelines, it still sounded insane. Nearly 1,500 miles of road through British Columbia and the Yukon, linking the railhead at Dawson Creek to airfields and bases in Alaska. Dense forests where the trees stood shoulder to shoulder, their roots knotted in mud and ancient ice. Rivers that could swell overnight into torrents strong enough to sweep away entire bridges. In summer, swarms of mosquitoes so thick that men would breathe them in. In winter, temperatures that could freeze oil and skin in minutes. And yet, despite all this, the argument crystallized in one sentence. The enemy had shown he could reach Alaska. America needed a way to reach Alaska faster, from within. Even so, the plan to build the Alaska Highway was greeted in many circles with ridicule. Editorials in some papers called it a boondoggle, a waste of men and machines that ought to be fighting in real theaters of war. Commentators described it as a road over the top of the world built for fear, not reason. In private, certain officers snorted at the notion of throwing bulldozers against permafrost. "We'll spend a fortune to carve a goat path," one colonel said, "and by the time we're done, the war will be over." Others saw politics behind the decision, muttering about Alaskan interests and Canadian lobbyists using wartime panic to push through a pet project. But the orders came anyway, because by 1942, survival trumped pride. In March, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was told to do the impossible. Start building from multiple points at once, and meet in the middle before the year was out. 7 engineer regiments moved north, their patches bright on coats that would soon be clogged with mud. Among them were black regiments, like the 93rd, 95th, and 97th, sent into the cold with the same orders as their white counterparts, but not the same respect. The army that desperately needed their hands still segregated their mess halls and barracks. Some high-ranking officers doubted their men could handle such a harsh environment, as if frostbite cared about skin color. The first days on the route did not look like the beginning of a grand strategic triumph. They looked like chaos. Men stepped off trains and ships into towns they had never heard of. Skagway, Whitehorse, Fort Nelson, staring at endless trees and mountains that seemed to push the sky downward. Equipment arrived in random clumps. Bulldozers with no spare parts, trucks with no chains, crates of food without kitchens to cook it in. The smell of pine sap and wet earth mixed with unfamiliar accents as Americans and Canadians tried to coordinate where there had been no reason to do so before. The line between Frontline and construction site blurred, because here, in the north, the road itself was the battlefield. To build a road anywhere is to declare war on the land in some small way. In the north, that war escalated quickly. Bulldozer blades bit into frozen ground that looked solid, but hid layers of ancient ice. When the sun climbed higher and lingered on the horizon for hours, that ice melted and the ground turned to jelly. Sections of road that had seemed firm in the morning slumped by afternoon. Trucks sinking until their axles disappeared beneath a surface that looked deceptively still. Men learned a new vocabulary. Muskeg, a kind of peat bog that behaved like a living creature, swallowing trees and machinery with patient, sucking force. They learned to read subtle shifts in color and texture, to distinguish between ground that would hold and ground that would betray them. The process was brutal and monotonous all at once. Day after day, teams of surveyors walked ahead of the main groups, their boots squelching, faces veiled in clouds of mosquitoes. They pushed through undergrowth, swung axes, drove stakes into earth that sometimes sounded hollow, sometimes rang like stone. Behind them, bulldozers roared, throwing up curtains of mud and shredded roots. Men rode those machines in layers of clothing stiff with sweat and dust, their ears ringing from the constant engine noise. They ate where they stopped, often in clouds of biting insects, hands numb from work, yet still grabbing for sandwiches made of whatever supplies had made it that far that week. Winter did did not wait for the road to be finished. It came down like a judge's gavel, sudden and absolute. Temperatures dropped, and with them, the nature of the enemy changed. Mud hardened into ridges that could break an axle. Rivers slowed, then froze, turning from obstacles into temporary allies. Frost crawled up tent walls at night, turning canvas into brittle shells. Men woke to find their breath hanging in the air as a visible fog, eyelashes crusted with ice. Tool handles stuck to bare skin. Engines needed fires lit beneath them just to start in the brittle dawn. Yet, in the perverse way of the North, many builders quietly preferred winter to the half-season of mud and insects. At least when the earth was frozen solid, it stayed put. The black engineer regiments, who had come into this alien world under a cloud of doubt cast by their own army, learned its rules as quickly as anyone. In some stretches of the route, they were given the worst terrain, the boggiest muskeg, the most treacherous hillsides. Not by accident, but because officers assumed that someone had to take those sectors. They did. Waist-deep in slime, they built corduroy roads, laying logs side by side over the bogs, the thud of each dropped trunk echoing in the still air. They built bridges in places where there had been no reason to cross before, hammer blows in the cold ringing out over water that steamed in the early morning. At the end of the day, they returned not to towns but to clusters of tents, their laughter and weariness rising together into the northern night, while, a few yards away, signs reminded them which mess hall they were allowed to enter. If this had been only a battle between men and landscape, the story would already be dramatic, but it was also a race against a thinking enemy and an unforgiving clock. While dozer blades scraped at frozen ground in the Yukon, Japanese forces were digging into the rocky slopes of Attu and Kiska. On those islands, the wind did not just blow, it screamed, tearing at tents and faces alike. Fog rolled in from the ocean without warning, thick enough to erase entire hillsides. American and Canadian forces preparing to retake those islands knew that every rifle, every shell they would need had to come across immense distances. Ships would carry them most of the way, but the chain of supply began far inland, at depots and railheads, some of which would soon be linked by this half-mad road. The other front, less visible but no less critical, ran not along the Aleutians, but across the continent to the Soviet Union. Under the Lend-Lease program, American factories were turning out aircraft that would be handed over to Soviet pilots, flown along a route that began in Great Falls, Montana, and stepped northward through Canada to Alaska, then across Siberia. Each stop along that chain demanded fuel, maintenance, spare parts, and men to supply them. The Alaska Highway would not directly carry those planes, but it would feed the airfields they depended on, bringing tankers of gasoline, loads of construction material, replacement engines, and the daily necessities of thousands of workers whose names would never appear in any combat report. Back in Washington at first, the reports from the north only confirmed the skeptics' sneers. There were logs describing machines swallowed whole by mud, men injured in landslides, sections of road that had to be abandoned and rerouted when the ground simply refused to cooperate. Photographs showed a highway that in some places was nothing more than a narrow scar bordered by jagged tree stumps, barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass. "We told you," some said quietly in elegant offices. "This is madness, a misallocation of precious resources." They did not see the faces of men who had spent 12 hours in the rain keeping a single bridge from collapsing. They only saw numbers and costs. But numbers can tell more than one story. As spring turned to summer, and then to another autumn, a different set of figures began to flow down the telegraph lines. Miles completed, bridges erected, river crossings secured. From multiple starting points, the road crept forward. From Dawson Creek heading northwest, from Whitehorse pushing east and west, from the Alaskan side reaching down toward the Canadian border. Map rooms that once showed empty, vague stretches now sprouted inked-in lines connecting dots that were becoming more than names. Fort Nelson, Watson Lake, Teslin, small circles of civilization marching into the void, anchored by the stubborn progress of the bulldozers. The moment when the Alaska Highway ceased being a joke and became a strategic fact did not happen in a single dramatic announcement. It happened instead in a series of mundane yet quietly astonishing scenes. A truck carrying aviation fuel that would once have required an elaborate chain of river barges and rail transfers now rolled, slowly but continuously, from the lower 48 up into the Yukon, its tires humming on packed gravel. A shipment of replacement parts for radar equipment bound for an Aleutian base left a warehouse and followed a single piece of paper instead of 6 different bills of lading. A telegram arrived at a distant outpost post with news not of shortage, but of surplus. More supplies on way, by road. On the ground, these changes were felt in backs and bellies long before they were appreciated in briefing rooms. At an airfield near Whitehorse, a mechanic who once had to cannibalize 2 broken engines to make one function could suddenly order spares, knowing that trucks could bring them. At an isolated garrison in Alaska, men whose rations had grown meager watched as convoys arrived with fresh food, tools, even newspapers that were only a few weeks out of date instead of months. Morale is an intangible thing, but it is built out of very tangible objects. Decent boots that fit, equipment that works, coffee that arrives on a cold morning. The highway, howling with the noise of passing vehicles, brought those things in a way that no memo could fully capture. The operation to retake Attu in May 1943 would test that invisible backbone to its limits. Landing on the fog-wrapped island, American soldiers found not a beach of glory, but a morass of mud, rock, and hidden guns. Japanese defenders had dug into the high ground, using the terrain and weather as allies. Every shell fired, every ration eaten, had traveled a chain of supply that began thousands of miles away. Ships still bore the final burden of delivery, laboring through rough seas, but the stockpiles they drew from, the equipment that had been sent forward to ports like Prince Rupert and Anchorage, had been fed by something new. Behind the fog and the surf, behind the clatter of landing craft, there was the grumbling, persistent current of trucks on gravel hundreds of miles inland. When Attu finally fell and American forces turned their efforts toward Kiska, only to find the island evacuated under cover of fog, the headlines spoke of battleships, submarines, and infantry. They did not mention corduroy roads laid under blackflies, or black engineers swinging axes in sleet, or Canadian bulldozer operators who learned to read the subtle language of Muskeg. They did not mention the captain standing on the shoulder of a half-frozen road in northern British Columbia, counting the trucks as they passed, and silently adding up the tonnage of hope they carried. Yet, without those anonymous movements, without those miles of scraped earth and gravel, the victories would have been far more uncertain and far more costly. It took just under 8 months, from March to October 1942, for the main line of the Alaska Highway to be joined from end to end. Engineers from the southern and northern teams met in a remote section of the Yukon, shaking hands atop muddy ground that had no name familiar to anyone back east. Photographs show them smiling, their uniforms caked, hands rough. In that instant, the skeptics' jeers did not disappear, but they faded under the weight of what had been done. A project many had called impossible or foolish had not only been completed, it had been completed in a span of time that defied previous engineering efforts in such terrain. Of course, a continuous line on a map did not mean the road was comfortable or safe. In its first years, the Alaska Highway was more trial than triumph for the men who had to drive it. Narrow curves clung to hillsides with steep drop-offs cloaked by trees. Dust in summer choked engines and lungs, reduced visibility to a few yards, and coated everything with a fine, choking film. When rain came, that dust turned to a slick that could send trucks sliding into ditches. In winter, snow and ice transformed certain sections into lethal ribbons. Drivers learned to read the subtle, treacherous shine of black ice, to listen to the tone of their own engines as if listening for a heartbeat. Yet, with each dangerous trip, the highway's value became harder to deny. Convoys that once would have taken weeks of coordination now could be assembled, loaded, and set rolling. If a bridge washed out, repair crews could reach it by the same road that had been broken. Supplies for air bases, radar sites, and remote garrisons no longer disappeared into the abstract shipping delays that haunted previous winters. They were tracked along a line that men could see and touch. When Washington planners looked up from their spreadsheets, they saw not only costs, but a web of capability stretching into a region they had once written off as a strategic dead end. The soldiers and civilians who lived along the road saw changes even more profound. Before the highway, many communities in the Yukon and northern British Columbia were seasonal, oriented around rivers and trading posts that rose and fell with the freeze and thaw of waterways. After the road, traffic became a year-round presence, sometimes a blessing, sometimes an intrusion. Indigenous families, who had moved along ancient trails, hunting and fishing according to patterns older than any map, watched as the highway cut across their territories. There were new opportunities, jobs, access to supplies, contact with the wider world, but also new disruptions, diseases, and pressures that would reshape their lives long after the war ended. For the black engineer regiments who had labored under segregated conditions to push the road forward, recognition was slow in coming. Official histories mentioned them in passing, often focusing on white officers or presenting the achievement as a faceless collective effort. But among the men who drove later convoys, stories circulated of a particular stretch of road hacked from the worst swamp by a regiment of soldiers who had to eat and sleep apart from the men they were saving. They told of a bridge built in record time over a flooded flooded river by a unit that not everyone in the army thought belonged there. History, stubbornly, preserved at least some of those names and numbers, like faint tire tracks in hardened mud. As the war ground on, the Alaska Highway settled into its role as a backbone rather than a headline. Ships continued to carry most of the tonnage north, because no road, however robust, could match the cargo capacity of a loaded freighter. But in times of crisis, when a ship was delayed, when weather grounded aircraft, when troops had to be moved, or equipment rushed forward unexpectedly, the existence of that land route often meant the difference between shortage and adequacy, between a defensive line that bent and one that broke. In strategy sessions, when officers traced supply lines with their fingers, the line through Canada and into Alaska no longer made anyone snicker. It was simply one more artery in the circulatory system of a global war. And when peace finally came, the crazy highway refused to fade. It remained, paved and improved, as a permanent connection between the far north and the rest of the continent. Tourists, years later, would drive it in comfortable vehicles, stopping at motels and gas stations that had grown like mushrooms along the route, marveling at the scenery without always realizing that their journey followed the scars of a wartime emergency. Truckers would curse its curves and grades, just as wartime drivers had, but they would also depend on it as an indispensable corridor for commerce. The road had been born out of fear and urgency. It matured into an artery of trade and travel. In the clandestine competitions of the Cold War that followed, the highway's existence carried another meaning. Airfields built along its course, originally intended to support ferrying aircraft and defending against Japanese attack, now became part of a network that watched the polar skies for Soviet bombers and missiles. Radar stations, listening posts, and new installations sprouted along the northern approaches, quietly relying on the same general routes that the war had carved. The idea that the North could be ignored, that its distance made it safe, died permanently somewhere between Dutch Harbor and the first bulldozer blade that bit into Yukon soil. For the men in Washington who had once mocked the idea of the Alaska Highway, the reckoning came not in dramatic apologies, but in the way their successors planned. When new threats appeared, when new regions once dismissed as remote suddenly mattered. The lesson of the Northern Road lurked in the background. Geography does not care about human convenience, only about reality. The front lines of a war or a peace could run through any landscape, frozen, flooded, or seemingly empty. Having a road already there, tested by mud and ice and arrogance, could shift the balance quietly but decisively. If you stand today at one of the old, still standing wooden trestle bridges, or at a lonely stretch where the trees lean close and the air smells of resin and rain, you can imagine the first convoys that rolled through in 1942 and 1943. You can hear, in your mind, the growl of underpowered engines, the clank of chains over rough timber, the shouted curses as someone fights a steering wheel on a curve that feels too narrow for survival. You can picture a young driver glancing up at the sky and wondering at least once whether some distant Japanese reconnaissance plane might be looking back, noting the thin, dusty line of road carving through the wilderness. You can imagine, too, the moment that driver reaches a distant base and sees men unloading supplies that would otherwise never have arrived. In the end, the Alaska Highway was not a monument to concrete or to conquest, but to a change in mindset. It began as an idea that polite society in Washington dismissed with a wave of the hand, too expensive, too difficult, aimed at a threat that didn't exist. It became, under the pressure of war, a vital instrument in securing a flank that the enemy had already proven he could touch. It was a reminder that arrogance about distance, about terrain, about what an enemy would never do, is itself a kind of vulnerability. Planners called the highway crazy until circumstances forced them to see that the true madness lay in trusting the map more than the reality on the ground. This is the story of how a road carved through mud, ice, and prejudice, through forests that had never heard the sound of engines, became the quiet hero of an invisible front. It did not fire a shot, did not sink a ship or down a plane, but by existing, by holding under the weight of countless tires and endless loads, it saved men who never knew its full story and secured a northern frontier that once seemed too distant to matter. In the long ledger of the Second World War, where glory is often assigned to battleships and bombers, there is a line written in gravel and frozen earth that reads, "The Alaska Highway, mocked, doubted, and then, when it was needed most, simply there."